Good evening, comrades. Welcome to Why Marx after our summer break. We've had a few weeks off. I hope you enjoyed your time off and are now looking forward to getting stuck back in. We're starting a new sub-series this evening, called Marx and Party Building. And when we say Marx, we also mean Marx and Engels. Furthermore, we also mean the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, which in its beginnings, Marx and Engels were quite involved, as well as in the First International. So there's often a misconception that Marx was spending his time mainly sitting in the British Library and studying, which he did, but he was also very involved, him and Engels, very involved in attempting to build an alternative parties from below. And so we're taking a look at their efforts and also how that can inform what we're doing today. Comrades will be aware that there are numerous projects going on at the moment of the left, now that the Labour Party is dead, end quote marks. That's a different discussion we probably can't get into tonight. And there are numerous organizations springing up with programs that look very similar to each other, to put it mildly. So we're taking a look at what Marx and Engels had to say on the issue, and then also what's going on today, and how what Marx and Engels wrote should inform our efforts, and if these organizations that are currently springing up have programs and have organizational methods that are in line with what Marx and Engels were writing. I think the answer is no, but let's discuss it a bit longer. We've got with us tonight Nick Rack and Ian Spencer. Ian is going to start with a look at a general overview of what Marx and Engels were writing, what they're involved in, and then Nick will look at the current perspective. Apologies from Kevin Bean. He is unfortunately ill tonight and he can't participate. In the next 10 weeks, we will be looking at some of these aspects in more detail. So tonight is more like a taste, an introduction to some of the issues we'll be discussing in depth over the next 10 weeks. So we are starting with Comrade Ian.
Good evening, comrades. I'm going to have a look at some of the early attempts of Marx and Engels to form political parties. We'll be looking in more detail at early form of Marxism in Marx's day, as it were, such as the First International. We've touched on it in the past, and we'll be developing it further later. I just wanted to start off with some of the earliest attempts at forming a party on the part of Marx and Engels, and look at some of the debates that were going on at the time and why they were happening then, and to show the extent to which they're still happening today. I mean, these include things like, do you have a party which is, as it were, theoretically pure? Does it have to be an explicitly Marxist party with a particular Marxist program, or could it be a broad coalition of people who are, broadly speaking, on the left, whatever that means? So what we'll see, I think, is that by looking at that early history, that many of the debates that are taking place today were taking place even in the 1840s, and they were resolved or not in a particular way. So without further ado, let's have a little look at Friedrich Engels, because it's often not appreciated that Friedrich Engels was a communist before Karl Marx was. He was associated with Moses Hess, a man who subsequently became more associated with Labour Zionism than communism, but in his early days was regarded himself as a communist. Engels and Hess would have meetings to which workers were invited about communism, and were developing a kind of a communist platform to the annoyance of Friedrich Engels' conservative father. Moses Hess and Engels and Marx, Marx and Engels conclusively fell out with Moses Hess over time as their development as communists surpassed that of Moses Hess. And as I say, Moses Hess subsequently went off to become more associated with Labour Zionism. Engels first went to Manchester in 1842, and the consequence, among the many consequences of that, was his exposure to the British, or the English in particular, Chartist movement. The condition of the working class in England in 1845 has got some fascinating appraisals of the nature of the Chartist movement. And this brings us neatly on to one of the things that we should think about when we're talking about forming the party. As we'll look at in the Chartists, they were not solely a workers' party. They were a mixture of liberal bourgeoisie and workers, and only later did they, as it were, split to be a socialist branch, as it were, and but with the liberal Chartists remaining in their position. So the other thing about Engels, quite apart from being a communist before Karl Marx was that he was the first one of the two to write the outlines of a critique of political economy in 1843. And Marx and Engels had met in 1842, but they didn't really hit it off, or rather, Marx was rather cold and aloof with Engels because he associated him with young Hegelians that he was arguing with. And this is another feature that will crop up again and again. The extent and the importance of polemic between different groups within the context of the workers' movement. So in 1842, not much contact between them, but when Marx read Engels' outlines of a critique of political economy in 1843, he was very impressed, and they met again in 1844 and spent days together just talking about positions that they had more or less arrived at independently, but in particular around the writings of Hegel. And later, when the condition of the working class in England was published, Marx had read the manuscript in 1844 and was thoroughly impressed with it. One other little footnote to the condition of the working class in England is that it probably wouldn't have been half as good a book had it not been for the partner of Friedrich Engels, Mary Burns, who was his partner. They never married because they didn't agree with the bourgeois institution of marriage. But Mary Burns was the one who showed Engels around Manchester and showed him just how impoverished people were. So there's Friedrich Engels. Focusing a little bit on the Chartist movement, hopefully Kevin will recover and can talk a lot more about the Chartist movement because it's kind of his specialist area, among others. So the Chartist movement from 1838 to 1857 was highly influential upon Engels. What's so striking in the condition of the working class in England is the way in which Engels is able to tease out the relationship between the liberal bourgeois elements of the Chartist movement, who basically put forward what we would regard as a kind of thoroughly reformist program today. In fact, everything was more or less conceded after the Chartists had disbanded, with the exception of annual parliaments. I mean, other ones include universal or male franchise, no mention of a female franchise, secret ballots, no property qualifications for MPs, and of course paid MPs so that ordinary workers could become a member of parliament. Members of parliament in those days were largely dependent upon their own private incomes from their estates. The importance about the 1832 Great Reform Act, of course, is that it retained a property qualification for being able to vote. The other point about the Chartists was that, as it were, the left wing of Chartism, and Engels talks about this in the context of the condition of the working class in England, formed the beginnings of a socialist movement in the context of Britain. Ernest Jones, for example, was a friend of both Marx and Engels, and was subsequently a member of the International Working Men's Association, the First International, in their Manchester branch. Here you see in 1848 in the picture is a photograph of the Chartist demonstration on Kennington Common, which is roughly where the Imperial War Museum stands now. And there were an estimated 200,000 people at this demonstration, which was extraordinary for its time. And if you consider that these are people who are speaking without microphones, who are just a huge mass of people in taking an active interest in politics, particularly on the back of the uprisings in Paris in 1848, the French Revolution of the French uprising in 1848 galvanized political movements across Europe, and of course there were revolutions in Germany and in Poland and so on. The other point about it, of course, is that seeing an independent workers' organization was an important formative part of what Engels was interested in. And it brings us on to an interesting point about the splits within movements. We currently have this, I always get this feeling, if you get three Marxists in one room, there'll be four factions between them. And the idea that somehow we couldn't possibly unite together. There were splits and divisions there too. But I want to also pose this other question. To what extent do revolutionaries make revolutions? After all, Marx famously said that man makes history, but not just as he pleases. And the extent to which revolutions also create the revolutionaries. And what we will see as we go through the series is the interrelationship between revolutionary movements, the general rise in militancy in the working class, and how that throws up political parties and amplifies the ones that already exist and extinguishes others. The League of the Just. This is Wilhelm Weitling, an early German communist, and he was a tailor by trade. And what was extraordinary about him is that he was the illegitimate son of a French soldier and a German chambermaid, and his father was killed in action subsequently. He grew up in absolute dire poverty, but nevertheless was very much a self-educated man and was fluent in French and German, lived variously in Paris and in parts of Germany, Leipzig in particular. The League of the Just was a secret society, and like secret societies of the time, had sort of rituals and things that, a bit like Freemasonry, where you could kind of take an oath and have secret signs and symbols and all the rest of it. The other thing about the League of the Just is that their slogan was "All men are brothers." The idea of an undifferentiated mass of humanity who are all have something in common. Whilst on the one hand, that's a banal truism, Marx and Engels were at pains to point out the importance of the proletariat as the revolutionary class. And at about the time, so the League of the Just was formed in 1834, but it consisted mostly of German émigrés. It subsequently merged with the Communist Correspondence Committee to form the Communist League, which, of course, subsequently commissioned the writing of the manifesto of the Communist Party. So here's this is Wilhelm Wolff, who was also he was of kind of peasant stock, as it were. Again, a working man who was a very close friend of Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels were going to dedicate Volume 1 of Capital to Charles Darwin because they were so impressed with, as it were, the dialectical imagery in The Origin of Species. But the death of Marcus Wolff in 1864 meant that the Volume 1 of Capital was dedicated to the indefatigable defender of the working class, Wilhelm Wolff. So the Correspondence Committee was founded by Marx and Engels and had branches, as it were, in Brussels, Paris, and London in 1846. And it was largely focused on a critique of other existing socialists. And here we come to an important point, which I think is important about the present as well. One should have no fear of putting forward a critical perspective on other groups and ideas, not with the aim of being sectarian, but because the ideas of Marx and Engels were really founded, really forged in the critique of other movements. So the true socialism of people, and people like Bruno Bauer and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Grun and Wilhelm Weitling. There's a lovely story about Wilhelm Weitling in a book by Edmund Wilson. I think it was published 1941, called "To the Finland Station." Edmund Wilson, "To the Finland Station," and he gives a kind of eyewitness account by Pavel Annenkov, who was a correspondent of Marx and was also friendly with Bakunin and one or two others. Annenkov was present when Marx met Wilhelm Weitling and recorded the conversation. And it was an interesting one. And, there's a resonance with contemporary political ideas. Weitling had an enormous amount of influence at the time. His politics is largely described as sort of being a mixture of Christian evangelism and communism. It was a kind of populist and not particularly scientific approach to the whole question of socialism. And the basis of the argument between Weitling and Marx was about the importance of having a scientific approach to the question of revolution and socialism. So Weitling, who had recently been in prison on more than one occasion, attacked Marx for basically doing nothing. And famously, Marx banged his hand on the desk and said, "Ignorance has not helped anyone yet." Notwithstanding all of that, they did join the League of the Just, and so eventually they merged to form the Communist League. This is Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. What's interesting about him, and we'll be talking more about the anarchists later, is that if you look at the output of Marx and Engels in this period, the Holy Family, the German ideology, and the poverty of philosophy. Of course, the German ideology wasn't published and consigned to the gnawing criticism of the mice. But the Holy Family and the poverty of philosophy were direct critiques of people like Proudhon, people like Grun, people like Bruno Bauer. I'll just single out Proudhon for a moment because, of course, he was hugely influential, and he and Marx were good friends. Marx seemed to fall out with everybody eventually, but there was a kind of unrelenting nature of the critique against Proudhon. Proudhon was, in response to a letter from Marx, willing to cooperate with Marx, collaborate with Marx under certain circumstances and so on. Marx had been at pains to explain to Proudhon the importance of Hegelian philosophy. And eventually Proudhon wrote a book called The Philosophy of Poverty, in which, of course, he expounded, among other things, his famous assertion that all property is theft. The title of Marx's book was a clear riposte to that, The Poverty of Philosophy. His accusation against Proudhon was that not only did he not understand the philosophy of Hegel, or indeed much else, but that his politics stemmed from a particular position, which was, he argued, really representative of an artisan petit bourgeoisie, rather than the idea of the proletariat as the universal class, the class that will do away with all classes. So the other point about this, of course, is that Proudhonist ideas are not far from the surface. If one looks at the Green Party, an idea of returning to some kind of simpler pre-capitalist formation or individual production or that kind of stuff. And Marx had absolutely no qualms whatsoever about breaking with him, despite their previous friendship, because of his insistence that it's important to have a science of politics, a science of revolution, a science of socialism, which of course was his point about Weitling as well. Weitling, he argued, would basically go out, stir up the masses, and lead them up a blind alley. So activity for activity's sake, rather, and failing to recognise that if you lead people up the hill often enough, all it leads to is demoralisation, and that therefore a proper appraisal of the forces, the balance of forces that are current in any given political situation is a vitally important part of any kind of communist party. So out of the League of Just and the Communist Correspondence Committee, and bear in mind the Communist Correspondence Committee would have counted its membership in tens. And for those of you who are members of parties that are in, tens and twenties, hundreds, whatever, it's always comforting to think that the Communist Correspondence Committee counted its membership in tens. The League of the Just was somewhat bigger. So the Communist League, founded on the 1st of June 1847 in London, it had an interesting kind of cellular structure. There were communes, and there was a kind of hierarchy. So communes and circles and leading circles, and a congress with a central authority to develop ideas. This period, 1847, 1852. Is also a phenomenally productive period in the works of Marx and Engels, not just in terms of the sheer volume of output, but also in terms of the importance of it. So the obvious one, of course, is the Manifesto of the Communist Party. The importance of the articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which was published from 1848 to 1849. Of course, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung was, of course, a direct reference to the earlier work, Rheinische Zeitung. And when I said that Engels was a communist before Marx, it wasn't that Marx was just sitting about. He was the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, and which was eventually closed down. Although Marx at that point wasn't a communist, really, his radicalism was such that it led to the closure of the Rheinische Zeitung in its censorship. He, for example, wrote extensively about things like laws prohibiting the collecting of wood in forests by poor people. So he, acidly remarked about the way in which trees have more rights and more protection than people. Later in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, Marx and Engels wrote work which was hugely influential and was regarded by Lenin as being the form that a communist journal should take, a communist newspaper should take. So the Communist League was eventually disbanded as a direct result of Prussian repression, and disbanded after the Cologne Communist trial in 1852. It was a period in which Marx and Engels decided, well, we're now in a period of revolutionary ebb tide, as it were. So, there wasn't much point in maintaining the Communist League. Communist organization was now illegal in Germany, and effectively they retreated to theoretical studies to prepare for the future. So although they were not in a party anymore as such, they were still very actively corresponding with others and still developing ideas. As if one wants to read a good account as well of Engels of the 1848 period, revolution and counter-revolution in Germany was made up of 20 articles that were published in the American press under the name of Karl Marx, so that Karl Marx could get the money. But Engels wrote most of them. So what I've tried to show then is that there are themes that crop up again and again, splits, divisions, and crucially, the importance of ideas, and that Marx and Engels at no point seem to have just simply gone along with other groups because they were more popular. Weitling was much better known than Karl Marx was. Jean-Pierre Proudhon was much better known than Karl Marx was. But that didn't mean that Karl Marx ever got into bed with the kind of proto-communist ideas of Weitling, and nor the petty bourgeois anarchism of Proudhon. So, comrades, thank you for that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ian. Could you stop screen share? That's great. Thank you for that introduction. And next is Nick Rack with a look at today's situation. I must say we would have had Kevin Bean coming up now and talking about mainly the Social Democratic Party in Germany and its predecessors and Marx and Engels' involvement with that. So this will come back at a later stage, and we'll probably get to it in the discussion as well. So over to you, Nick. Hi.
Thank you, Comrade Tina. Thanks, Ian, for your talk, and welcome, comrades. So I've been asked to speak about the current situation and what position should we take with regards to party and party organisation in Britain, and for that matter, internationally as well. The background, I suppose, to this question is, in the recent period, the defeat of Corbyn, what I would describe as the rout of the left supporters of Corbyn, and the demoralisation and scattering of large numbers of people who had previously been members of the Labour Party, or perhaps more particularly those who joined the Labour Party to support Corbyn in 2015. And what we've got now, as anybody with eyes, and I'm sure that includes all of you, ears following the news, is that Starmer, having deceived his way to the leadership of the Labour Party, tricking people that he would stick by the 10 pledges of Corbyn, of course, has abandoned every single one of them, carried out a massive witch hunt of socialists, prescribed organisations of the left, of Marxists, depriving them of Labour Party membership, has just this week introduced into the cabinet in his reshuffle a whole cohort of Blairites, and showing absolutely what he wants the Labour Party to be in office, and that is a completely safe pair of hands from the point of view of the ruling class, of the capitalist class, of the bourgeoisie. It's going to do nothing to upset capitalism. It's not going to intrude on its turf. And as a consequence, in my opinion, there are going to be big struggles arising out of the position that Starmer and the Labour Party carry out if, as I expect, they win the next general election. So my perspective, it may not be shared by everybody, but my perspective is that Labour will win the next election. Of course, that's not a guaranteed. Things can change. But in order to carry out the programme that Starmer and Reeves and others have set, that will inevitably lead them into conflict with the trade unions and the working class more generally. And so we see in social media, on Facebook, in Twitter, on this, that, and the other, in the left press, all sorts of discussions taking place about what the left should do. And so I'm going to make a few points, first of all, about the left, because it's disparate, it's not homogenous. There are those of us, and I most likely include everybody on this call who, if you've been coming to these meetings from the beginning, would probably describe yourselves as Marxists, as communists in Marx's meaning of the word, or socialists, again, in Marx and Engels' meaning of the word. And from my point of view, I use the term socialism and communism to mean the same thing, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But we've got Marxists, and we've then got people who I describe as social democrats. I can call them reformists. That's not intended to be a word of what's the word I'm looking for? It's a criticism, but it's not meant to be personal. It's describing a philosophy, a political philosophy, which was anathema to Marx. It's a philosophy that believes either that socialism can come about by bit gradualism towards of the capitalist system and can evolve over time into its opposite. I don't think there are many people who actually believe that in reality now. And so there are very few people of that type of gradual evolution from capitalism into socialism. And then there are others who call themselves socialists. And I include in this people like Jeremy Corbyn and most of his supporters, a different form of social democracy. And that is people who don't have the intention of changing society, of overthrowing capitalism, of getting rid of capitalism, but seek to manage it. Starmer, who's not a social democrat at all, in my opinion, is a technocrat who wants to manage capitalism on behalf of the capitalist class. He thinks he can do it better than others. So amongst all of these different groups, there are various discussions. And as Ian said, these discussions, you can find echoes of them, or in outline, discussions about the issues going all the way back to the 1840s and in every single decade since. The question of what sort of nationalization, for example, do we call for? And Marx's criticism of what he called Bismarckian socialism, Bismarck being the Chancellor of Germany, right-wing Chancellor of Germany, beholden to the Kaiser, with whom Lassalle, one of the early leaders of the German workers' movement, had relations, negotiations, and sought concessions. Again, that Marx and Engels criticized that, and in my opinion, had repercussions into the development of the German working class when the two German workers' organizations merged in 1875 at the Gotha Congress. But maybe if I have time, I'll come back to that point. But as Ian said, at each stage of these discussions, whether it was with Proudhon, whether it was with Lassalle, whether it was with the anarchists of Bakunin at the time of the First International, there was a constant polemic between Marx and Engels and their followers, their supporters, with others on the left within the workers' movement and petty bourgeois types who hovered around the workers' movement, criticizing their ideas from the standpoint that they had developed as young men in the 1840s, leading to the publication of the Communist Manifesto in February of 1848. And it's interesting that Communist Manifesto, it was called the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And there was no Communist Party at the time. But it was written by Marx and Engels, probably mostly by Marx, with Engels' support. Written by Marx to get down their ideas, to intervene in what they anticipated and which was born out, the democratic struggles that broke out across Europe in 1848, to intervene and to try to organize the working class. And they constantly thereafter criticized the weakness of the capitalist class, their inability for the most part to campaign effectively to win democratic reforms, and again pointing to the fact that the only force in society that could change it fundamentally in the interest of the majority was the working class. And Marx came into communism as a result of his critique of the left Hegelians, of which he had been a part, and his criticism of them because they didn't involve themselves, they didn't get bothered, they didn't dirty their hands with what he saw as politics. And he saw this, he came to the conclusion that this was a huge mistake, and he broke with them, and he saw the necessity of being involved in politics. And he and Engels, for the rest of their lives, devoted their efforts to an understanding and criticism of capitalism, and just as important, to arguing for the type of organization that they saw as being necessary to confront capitalism and to supersede it with a new society, a new mode of production, which they called communism or socialism. And in my opinion, there's a lot of confusion on the left, including on the Marxist left, about the meaning of those two words. Some people see a complete difference, seeing socialism as being social democracy, communism as being communism, perhaps even as Stalinism. Some people see socialism as being a first stage towards communism. I think that's a misunderstanding of Marx's writing in the Critique of the Gotha program. Anyway, from my point of view, when I talk about socialism and communism, I'm referring to a society in which classes have been abolished, exploitation has disappeared, there is no exploiting class, and we get to a society over a period of time where everybody contributes according to their ability, and everybody gets what they need according to their needs. And that is communism or socialism, a society without a state, to use Engels' terminology from Socialism, Scientific and Utopian, anti-Dühring, which preceded it. The state is not abolished, it withers away, and the government of people is replaced by the administration of things and the organization of production. And so it's a society in which private capital, private ownership of the means of production, that's the land, the waters on it, the minerals in it, the factories that have been built, the science and technology that drive them, the transport, all of that has been taken into common ownership and is organized democratically. Production is planned to meet the needs of society. Now, in my opinion, that's what Marx and Engels argued for. That's what their supporters argued for. And in the Communist Manifesto from the very beginning, Ian's just talked about the League of the Just, and that name was changed and the way that it was organized was changed. And it was changed from being a secret organization into the Communist League. And the Communist Manifesto said communists disdain to conceal their ideas and their aims. Disdain to conceal. So communists, Marxists, so I'm talking about communists and socialists in the way that they spoke about the new society, we do not hide our ideas. I've found it troubling throughout my political life how many Marxists who've clearly taken the step at some stage, just as Marx did, just as Engels did, they've made the leap to becoming communists, socialists. And yet, having done that, many seem to draw the conclusion that others in the working class, the people that they work alongside, go to the pub alongside, maybe invite for dinner and so on, that those workers, those working class people, can't also draw the same conclusions. And that is a big problem today in Britain, and I'm sure it's the case internationally, because if you look at the discussion, the debate that I've been describing, if you like, the aftermath of Corbynism, the coming to power of Starmer, and the reaction to that, you have a section of Marxists who, instead of shouting their Marxism, shouting their communism, their socialism from the rooftops, and saying the defeat of Corbyn shows that we need to go much, much further. We cannot limit ourselves to managing capitalism, tinkering with it. Instead, what we have in various different forms, and particularly in the form of Transform, the launching of the new party that's been announced several weeks ago, another attempt at what I'm going to call a broad left party. A broad left party that seeks to bring people who are social democrats, that is, who believe that capitalism can be reformed and work in the interests of ordinary people, and those Marxists who presumably don't agree with that, but are keeping their mouths shut in order.
5 more minutes, comrade.
5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Wow. And so the argument between broad party and communist or socialist party, for me, is central in this period. Our ideas as communists or socialists have been pushed back. There's no question about that, internationally and in Britain. But we just have to accept where we are and then not accept where we are. We recognize it, it's a fact. How do we get out of that redoubt? How do we get out of the corner into which we've been pushed? We can't do it by hiding our ideas. We can't do it by pretending that we're something other than we are, because if we want to build a party, then we have to answer the question, what is that party? For me, it's got to be a party that says on its banner that we want to overthrow capitalism and replace it with socialism. We have to explain that that can only be achieved by the working class coming to power. And to do that, the working class needs a party committed to that aim, that ultimate goal. And the party has to be completely democratic. It has to be bold, confident, clear, unambiguous. And so those of us who are communists or socialists, whatever we call ourselves, but with that same ultimate goal, we have to come together and discuss how we can go about building that party. And I'm sure these discussions are taking place in all sorts of places. I'm coming across groups of people in different parts of the country who are discussing these ideas. Some of you may know that I'm involved in a group called Talking About Socialism from a Marxist point of view. And we've been discussing exactly this question. And we've just launched a statement which sets out our ideas. And I'm going to post a link to it in the chat so that people can read it. But we start out by saying, those Marxists and communists, whatever our differences might be on the fundamentals, which we set out what we believe those fundamentals are, a complete break with capitalism, an international outlook and the need for an international change, a revolution. By that, I mean a fundamental change from one form of mode of production to another. And we make it clear that we do not mean by communism Stalinism. We are opposed to the idea of socialism in one country. There is no national way forward to socialism. And so we've set that out, and we basically would like to introduce that to everybody on the left, the Marxist left, and people who do not consider themselves to be Marxists, for discussion and debate, and to see whether it's possible for us to work together with the aim of bringing into being a new party, a party that's committed to those aims, the aims that were set out in the Communist Manifesto, addressing what Marx and Engels called the property question, the need to expropriate the private ownership of the means of production. Now, I have serious criticisms, arguments against those who advocate a broad party. Even the Marxists, there are Marxists who argue for that, including the idea that's current, that what we should look towards is a new mass working class party based on the trade unions. Now, of course, a new communist or socialist party would have to be based on the working class, and it would have to recruit from the working class. It would have to recruit trade union members. But if we were to seek trade unions to break from Labour, which they may do, but not this side of a general election, and if they were to form a new party, they would, in essence, in my opinion, simply be repeating what was done in 1900 with the creation of the Labour Party. And if we look at the trade union bureaucracy, we see that over the last 150 years, we've had the development of a very entrenched, politically conservative, if not reactionary, trade union bureaucracy, where even the left trade union leaders do not have the confidence in their members and do not put forward socialist arguments. Last year's TUC, for example, the right-wing GMB put forward a motion to the TUC Congress calling for the state to invest more in the production of arms. That's a position that's completely anathema to any socialist or to any socialist party. Unite, which is seen as a left-wing trade union, supported that motion, backed it, and it was narrowly passed. In my opinion, you could not have a genuine socialist party that was controlled by trade unions who were able to impose on the party that sort of position. So we need a completely new party that doesn't hide its ideas. In fact, it makes a benefit. It turns to its advantage the clarity of its aims, the unambiguous nature that we want to get rid of this rotten system that destroys lives, that destroys communities, that sends people to battle over profits, in which people die in childbirth when they don't need to, in which millions die of hunger or because of lack of access to water. We do not hide the fact that we have nothing but contempt and hostility for this system and the corruption that it generates. So we want to go to the working class in every single part, working class estates, roads, towns, colleges, schools, workplaces, and so on, and persuade people by the power of our arguments, by the power of our facts and our figures, and the fact that we will get involved in every aspect of working class struggle to help the working class struggle for reforms now, but point out that if we don't want to spend the rest of our lives and the lives of generations to come repeating that struggle, We need to consign this system to the dustbin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. We are now doing what we usually do, have a quick chat and then opening up for questions from the floor. To good introduction, I think you both made a very, you emphasized the fact that both Marx and Engels were involved in debates throughout their lives, public debates, open debates, not afraid of critiquing each other and, their comrades, even often quite harsh, sometimes comradely, but very often in a very harsh way in order to get to political clarity, which a lot of the left today seem incredibly scared of. And that puts people off, etc. And Nick mentioned, or I think it was Nick or Ian, in the name of sectarian. It's sectarian if you critique people who you disagree with, which I think you both pointed out is exactly the wrong way. I was going to quickly share something that we've discussed previously, and it fits very well into this session. Talking about the discrepancy of so-called Marxists who call themselves Marxists and then argue until the cows come home against a communist party or a Marxist party. They will argue that Marx in particular made the point in the Communist Manifesto that, and I've put it on the screen here, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Very famous quote, very, very famous. When we were discussing the Communist Manifesto for these sessions, I read it in German, and then I noticed this is really different in the original German. And I wasn't the first one to pick up on that. Hal Draper did a very interesting book on the whole mistranslations and various things that happened in the Communist Manifesto. And he translated the section much better as the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' party. They have no interest separate from the interests of the whole proletariat. They do form a separate party. They do get together and argue for communist politics, etc. So it is exactly the opposite. And to this day, and despite comrades like Hal Draper being very well known, have made a huge effort to try and bring this home, this message that this was a mistranslation, and that the whole of the Communist Manifesto, as Nick and in particular pointed out, it is a program for communists. And then there will be Marxists today using the Communist Manifesto as a reason why we shouldn't organize as communists, which is the mind boggles. So with this in mind, I was going to ask you both, Ian first, this discrepancy between we should allow debates, clearly, but we're also fighting for a communist program. We want to win people over to communism. How do we do this in terms of, or how did Marx do it, in terms of what kind of organization to build? Do we build a purely communist organization? Do we build something where we say anybody who doesn't agree with our program needs to leave? Do we want to win over forces that are not yet on board, or do we engage perhaps in different organizations at the same time, bringing home those messages? What did you reading up on Marx and Engels again, what is the message you think you got there?
Historically, Marx is absolutely clear. I mean, it was almost completely uncompromising with people like Proudhon or Weitling or whatever else. I mean, and had no qualms whatsoever about breaking off a personal friendship with them or whatever. That doesn't mean to say we wouldn't have comradely discussions. Of course we do. But I think what really distinguished Marx and Engels was they're determined to have a scientific socialist approach, not just something that was, he could have gone along. I mean, there weren't even that many people at his funeral, Marx. So there's no qualms whatsoever about sticking to an explicitly communist position, and not going along with the kind of what he regarded as silly populism of people like Weitling or Proudhon. There were other, I mean, we'll be looking at this, I'm sure, in later sessions. So Hyndman, as leader of the Social Democratic Federation, was absolutely despised by Marx and Engels, and because of his opportunism, because of his failure to have any kind of scientific approach to socialism and so on. Engels is very critical of English socialism as it was when he was writing the condition of the working class in England, but he was able to understand, as any scientific socialist would, that ideas develop and parties develop. And what's important, I think, is to understand that the way in which political movements throw up parties as well. We can expect to see different formations taking place, and we're not going to like them, not all of them. And I think that the importance is not to get suckered into going along with something populist, in the style, for example, of the Respect Coalition, for example. I mean, how silly did it make the SWP look getting into bed with George Galloway, you know, an unreconstituted Stalinist. I mean, and now going down the sort of red-brown route of populism with the Workers' Party. At some point, yes, there are people you can work with in a principled way, and we should work with people who, in a principled way. If we go along with the idea, for example, that we're going to stand candidates in elections, there's no point three Marxist parties all vying for the same few hundred likely voters. It's necessary to have some sort of coalition. But of course, why are you doing it? Why are you standing candidates? Our only aim really should be to act as a tribune for the proletariat, and to argue for socialism, which can only really come about by revolutionary means. And we shouldn't be shy about that, because after all, you know, usually the people who embrace a parliamentary road to socialism end up dead. And Marx and Engels understood that, and they also understood that it's important to pick your moments and pick your battles. As we'll go on to see later, you know, Marx was keen that the communards didn't take power in Paris, because he knew that they would lose, and that defeat would set the workers' movement back for generations, which of course it did. So, I mean, the reason for starting with a kind of historical perspective is to show that the same themes are about in the 1840s, and it continues to the present. And what do we mean when we say we were going to work with somebody in a principled way?
Of course, some communists, including myself, for my sins, didn't get involved in Respect in order to, you know, win people over, but also expose some of the chauvinism that was going on there. But, you know, at the beginning, I think we joined with an understanding of trying to, you know, have a political argument and win comrades to a more principled political basis. All three of us were members of the Labour Party at some stage, isn't it? So communists do, of course, get involved with non-communist organizations and trying to win over others to the communist program. Nick, do you see that as a contradiction, that you have to, you know, you form a communist stronghold of some sort, or a communist tendency, as well as getting involved in larger formations, broader formations?
Well, I think communists have to intervene everywhere where there's political struggle and political discussion. So if we had a sizable communist party, in my opinion, it would be remiss, if not completely wrong, not to discuss how to orient towards workers who still look to Labour. And it may be that you, for example, have a faction in the Labour Party. You know, these are tactical questions for me, which too frequently have led to splits on the Marxist left, when really they are discussions about tactics, and sometimes even discussions about language or where to put a comma. I'm being a bit facetious, but egos play a big role in the Marxist left. Sectarianism There's two different types of sectarianism, in my opinion. There's sectarianism between the rival groups, where one group will say that another group, which clearly is Marxist, oh, they're not proper Marxists. I've been called on Facebook by a young communist, I won't say who it is or what organization there are, but I was told that I wasn't a Marxist because I wasn't a member of their party. So I thought, fair enough. That's a sort of sectarianism. Perhaps a worse sectarianism, and Marxists can fall into this. And I suppose the worst example is the social fascism period of the Stalinists in the early 1930s, who saw the social democratic workers as belonging to a social fascist party, and therefore they were social fascists. That's a type of sectarianism of the worst, because it led to the defeat of the German working class. And I would not be hostile to any person that remained in the Labour Party, who saw themselves as a militant trade unionist, a socialist. I'd have discussions and we'd produce material. So you can have sectarianism towards the mass organizations. Any communist party that's launched, say in the next 3, 4, 5 years, say we did it tomorrow, it would be a handful of people. It may grow to several thousand. It may grow to several tens of thousands, but the Labour Party still numbers its membership in the tens of thousands. And if you count the trade union membership, it's in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions. So the communists have to have arguments to draw those people away from social democratic ideas. And that's got to be in the form of writing, of leaflets. But more importantly, perhaps, is arguing for a strategy and a program for winning battles, but pointing forward the political struggle. I've got a quote from Wages, Prices and Profit. It was written in 1865, and I dug it out because one of the comrades earlier on asked a question. I don't know if you were going to get to it, but the question was, what do we make of the call for the abolition of the wages system? And I've had this thrown at me from all sides in the past. Some people saying, because the SPGB, for example, they say abolish the wages system, and that's all they say, in a sense. And maybe I'm being unduly harsh. And in one way, if you're speaking to an untutored worker who says, well, what do you mean? I need my wages to live. Then that's the start of the discussion, because Marx said in 1865, when he was in the first international, the International Working Men's Association, he said, instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, which is what you see on most trade union demonstrations today, 170 years after Marx wrote, he said they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. And what he's saying there really is, he's saying we need to have demands and discussion about the nature of the society. What is happening when you go to work and you get paid your wages? You are only paid for a proportion of the day that you've worked. You go to work for 8 hours, you're paid for 2 of them. The other 6, the boss gets it gratis, free. That's his profit. And most workers actually understand that. So Marx criticized the trade unions, for example, say they fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it. So he's saying that the trade unions have a narrow horizon where all they're seeking to do is increase the wages rather than change the system whereby the worker is exploited. They have to do both at the same time. I believe that if those arguments were taken in a simple form, simple language, conversations on picket lines, in factories, in workplaces, workers would grasp that straight away, because they know the only reason they're there is because the boss can make a profit out of them. Do they want to keep on doing that, or do they want a system that is communism, in which what they do, what they produce, is for the benefit of all, not just for the benefit of their boss? And I think you could go to any country, any town, any street in the world and pose that question, and people would say, no, I think that's far better. What we produce should be for the benefit of everybody. I say, well, you're a communist. And that's how we build a party. And the ideas of communism have inspired millions and millions, sometimes in the perverted, distorted form of Stalinism. But for the workers that joined those Stalinist parties, they didn't necessarily see those distortions. What they saw was a party fighting and struggling for a better world for them and their families. So we have to have the debate, we have to have the discussion inside the party. Personally, I think that there are some, if you like, parameters, outlines, whereby if you didn't fall within that, I would say, well, you're not really a communist. We have a discussion and so on. Most people in the first stage are going to be not communists, they're going to be social democrats. So we have friendly relations with the social democratic workers, while criticizing mercilessly their leaders and pointing out where they're failing, how they're wrong. I don't know if I've answered your question, Tina.
Yeah, no, you have. I mean, what can we even do in this period? I mean, you mentioned, the Corbyn movement has been well and truly defeated. It was a huge political defeat for our class, and we're still suffering from it. I do agree with you that things will change once the Labour Party is in government. It looks likely. I mean, nothing is set in stone. All sorts of things could happen. Things will open up again when the Labour Party comes into government, and people might look for answers. But with the unions, still attached to the Labour Party, and I fear most of them will remain with the Labour Party because they think they get more out of being attached to a party in government than being away from it. Can we launch a communist party that is worthy of the name, or are we doing preparatory work at the moment? Are we really preparing for a time when the working class is on the move? How's that relationship between party and class? Ian, do you want to how did Marx perhaps look at it?
Well, at the moment, we're in a period when revolution's not likely to happen immediately. And what did Marx and Engels do when revolution was in the ebb tide? They carried on doing the patient work of corresponding with other communists, of maintaining links, of working on the theory side of stuff. So, I mean, most of the organizations that have styled themselves, usually with some sort of grandiose set of abbreviations, many of them have done at least one useful thing, is that they've introduced people to Marxist ideas. They have their own distortions, their own peculiarities, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that I have some monopoly on wisdom. So all we can do, I think, is keep our powder dry. I think we continue to carry out educational work, theoretical work, trying to influence wherever and whenever we can, and accept the fact that it may well be that it's the revolution that will make the revolutionaries. Something will be happening. I'm not suggesting just sort of some catastrophism that somehow once the USA goes to war with China, then maybe then something will happen. It may well do, and of course we will. There will be significant world events, but look at how things have changed already. I mean, we don't have to consider a large Stalinist Communist Party sabotaging workers' movements around the world anymore. We don't need to be pessimistic about everything.
Thank you, Ian. Nick?
Yeah, I'd probably take a slightly different approach from Ian, which is, part of what we're talking about, the debate and discussion, because we need everything being put in. My own view is that waiting or expect, I'm not saying that Ian said this, but there's a danger that it might be misinterpreted as this. If the revolution or a revolutionary movement or revolutionary events take place, as they will, and the working class is not politically advanced enough through its party to know how to direct that revolution, then the likelihood is that that revolution will be defeated. And so my conclusion from that is that we have to build as urgently as possible, although we have to be patient. So I've coined this oxymoronic phrase, patient urgency, or urgent patience, you can invert it. The idea is that our task is urgent because capitalism is in a crisis, and that crisis will throw up tumultuous events into which a communist party really ought to be present to intervene. But obviously we can only go as fast as we can go, which is where the urgency comes in. We have to be patient at the same time. But I would like to see those of us in this discussion who agree that we need a communist party to be discussing serious steps about how we go about constructing that. And the more we discuss it and the more meetings we have, the more likely we'll be able to come together and say, well, we're going to launch it. And Marx and Engels, Ian said they had 10 people in the room, they maybe had 20. In the Communist League, they may have had a few hundred. Even then, you had Willits, who challenged Marx to a duel. We think arguments over a pint are a problem, but it's not come to that. But it's actually urgent, and one reason why I say that it's even more urgent than in the past is this: in the 1920s and the 1930s, when the capitalist world went into crisis, went into recession, mass unemployment, and people were looking for an alternative to the system, the petty bourgeois went in one direction, and that's they went to the fascists in Italy, France, Hungary, and so on. And the working class, its most advanced sections, went to the communists because they had behind them the towering historical event of the Russian Revolution. What we have today is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. We have the misnamed Chinese Communist Party running what I consider to be capitalist China. We have no mass parties arguing for an alternative from a communist point of view. And the danger is, as we see already, that sections of the working class go over to right-wing populism or fascism. And that is happening around the world. And we need, on the left, a communist pole of attraction. And it's urgent. And we've seen in perhaps in a glimmer or a shadowy form, even in Britain, in some aspects of the Brexit movement and under Johnson, and again in COVID with all sorts of conspiracy theories, how that sort of movement could develop. So we have to get a clear, unambiguous communist pole of attraction launched, serious. That means it debates with itself in front of the class and it tries to unify. At the moment, I don't think it's going to happen, but I would argue that the Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, Socialist Appeal, the CPGB, the others, many of whom I've got differences about this, that, and the other, and even about how they work, but they should be in the same organization, arguing collectively, so that, in a sense, the hostility that exists between those is over a period of time overcome through common struggle, joint efforts. But in the meantime, we who are not in those parties for obviously one reason or another, we have to do what we can to build our group of communists. And that's what our statement of the Talking About Socialism is designed to assist in that process. And I'm going to get the link and put it in the chat.
Well, certainly after Tony Blair came into power, into office, that led to the formation of the Socialist Alliance, which had its own set of problems, etc. But certainly things might start moving very quickly once there's an election. Very pleased that the first speaker from the floor is none other than Tony Greenstein, who might be quite surprised he's able to participate, as he's almost been locked up. To be honest, I thought you had it, but we're very pleased.
You're not the only one, Tina. I also thought, as I listened to the judge's ramble, that our days were numbered, as it were. But having made an outrageous speech, he then saw the wisdom of not imposing immediate custodial sentences. But to get back to really the topics today, I mean, you quoted Marx about creating a special party of the working class or not forming a separate party from the working class parties. But the problem we have today, of course, is that there are no working class parties. It's quite clear that Starmer's Labour is an alternative party of capitalism today, and that is his project to eradicate any traces of the left. And I think we have to accept that that has been remarkably successful, albeit it's generated a massive amount of hostility, not least the fact that 1/3 or more of the Labour Party membership have already resigned or been thrown out. Having said that, I think we have to ask ourselves a question. It is a quite serious question, really, which is why it is over a century since we last had a working class revolution, and that revolution was in the most backward country in Europe, a country where capitalism had barely begun, in a sense. So it was uniquely weak, and it was embroiled in a war which sapped the strength of that regime. I don't, of course, have any ready answers, but I do throw out a number of questions and observations, because I mean, I consider myself a revolutionary socialist who cannot see revolution on the horizon, and I think that poses great problems in an era where capitalism is quite capable of destroying the planet we live in, and that is a very serious issue for people, because capitalism, of course, is completely asocial, amoral, and cannot see beyond the end of its nose, which is why it can't plan anything, least of all for a global climate crisis. And the question is this: certainly in the West, the working class, the proletariat, was always seen as the agent of revolution, because without having an agent, who is going to usher in socialism? But today we have a working class, certainly in Britain, but I think we can say in the rest of Western Europe, if not throughout Europe, which is atomized, which is depoliticized, which is incredibly weak politically. And it shows no sign of living up to its historic role. If anything, if any working classes are revolutionary potentially, it is in the global south, in the countries that imperialism dominates. So it really raises a question for us as to what is our role. And I certainly see in that context, I see it as being impossible to form a revolutionary party in Britain. It's clearly been tried. We have a multitude of sects. None of them have succeeded. Most of them see their main enemy as being another sect, or in the case of the SWP, it is really acting as nothing more than the left cover for the trade union bureaucracy. For instance, Stand Up to Racism, its front, can quite happily march with Zionists and thus piss off everybody involved in Palestine solidarity, which is a growing movement in this country, but it has no qualms about doing that, because financially it sees it as advantageous to retain the backing of the trade union bureaucracy. But it has, in a sense, always been an opportunist party, and that is the largest party, albeit not particularly massive. I also think there is an obsession still on the left with what I have termed dead Bolsheviks. I mean, there was no doubt very many lessons that can be learned from the Bolshevik Revolution, but we do have to accept that capitalism today has stabilized itself, and imperialism in particular, in a way that would not have been foreseen over a century ago. And we have to update our analysis, and I don't see a great sign that the left has done that. How do we progress ahead? Well, firstly, I think it's clear that we do need to form some kind of left party in which revolutionaries can operate, but which will not be a revolutionary party. We will have to work with those, for instance, those amigas from what was the Corbyn movement, for example, because I mean, Corbynism, for all its many, many faults, not least, of course, the weakness of Corbyn itself, demonstrated that socialist and radical ideas do have a purchase in certain situations. And I think the 2017 general election proved that beyond a doubt. I mean, Corbyn himself was speaking to absolutely massive audiences. I mean, I was staggered when I saw the meeting in Leamington Spa. Anyone knows Leamington? It's a pretty middle-class, prosperous area in Warwickshire. I mean, I think he was speaking to 9,000 people, an open-air meeting. I mean, that was really quite unique. So the ideas of social ownership, public ownership, and so on do have a resonance amongst people. The question is how we tap into that and how we proceed with that. I also think that in terms of the social movements that are thrown up, whether it's around the global crisis, whether it's around racism, with us in Black Lives Matter, which was a big movement at its time, although it's died away, I think our message has to be that none of these issues can be solved in the context of capitalism. You cannot, for instance, green capitalism. You cannot solve the global warming crisis because capitalism always puts profit ahead of any other priority. So you have this absurdity of carbon credits. I mean, companies latch onto that and simply make a buck whilst passing on the pollution to someone else. So I just throw out those really some ideas. I don't have any solutions, but I am firmly convinced that in non-revolutionary times such as this, and I don't see any end to that as well, I do think that our main task is the formation of a mass socialist party, which certainly has capitalism as its abolition as its aim, even if there is disagreement about how you go about that. Okay, thank you very much.
Somebody called your contribution very pessimistic. Interesting.
I am pessimistic. I accept that. I suppose it's pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, whatever it was Gramsci said.
Thanks, yes. Tony. I'm going to take a couple more people before I bring the speakers back in. Minnie and then Soraya. Hi, Minnie.
I think it's been a really good and inspiring meeting, and thanks to Ian and Nick for the talks, and Tina too for brilliant questions. Right, yeah, on the Corbynism thing, Starmer's regime have taken down videos from YouTube now. They're erasing Corbyn and the masses that attended those rallies from history. They've left one up, I think it's his last conference speech. Something about, didn't Lenin, or was it Trotsky? I can't remember. I wouldn't pass a test, put it that way. But he said there wasn't a revolution on the horizon, and then there was one. I just want to say, I think there's a lot of people out there who think we should have an anti-capitalist party. I did go on the first Transform meeting, just see what it was like, and I put something in the chat, and I actually raised the question. I wrote, if this is a reformist party, it won't work. We tried this under Corbynism. Transform is calling to tax the rich, yet we need an anti-capitalist party where the means of production is held in common ownership. Shouldn't be aiming to make anyone rich, but to put people, our health, housing, climate above profit, move to socialism, communism, no more wars, international solidarity. One of the leaders of one of the groups actually mentioned it, my comment, and said, I would like this to be an anti-capitalist party, but we can't decide this. We've got to decide together. So I'm just saying there are people there. Also, speaking to someone from TWTs at the World Transformed the other day, and I said that because I'm starting to say it in conversations, we need to move to a communist socialist party. And he said, I couldn't agree more. It's really interesting the way people are thinking now. Also, I want to say we're up against enemies. They're killing us. They're killing us. I've got a graph here about the increase, COVID, the increase in how many people waiting for ambulances. People are dying waiting for ambulances. And there was a bar chart on Twitter today comparing the amount of deaths, the increase in the amount of deaths per age group from a section of weeks in 2019 to a section of weeks, I think it was 23 weeks in 2023. And the increase in deaths in the 15 to 44-year-old group was up at 18% on 2019. In the 75 to 84 group, it was getting up there, up to 17% or so. Yeah, I agree with Nick. I think we need to get a program out. And I think we need to have practical ideas. I think we need to talk to people. I think there's too much division. I think we need to encourage solidarity. There's too much, yeah. We need to bring engineers, health people, all sorts of people on board, all working class. Communist pole of attraction, agreed. That's what we need. And we need debates. I've been learning about Marx since 2015. I was astounded when I found out about, when I read what alienation was. I always say that, but I was astounded. It really taught me, hey, this is what I'm in. This really is what I'm in. Yeah, I know wanting to wind me up. Also, we can do without trade union bureaucracies. They're not with us. Yeah, there is a bit of an obsession with dead Bolsheviks, and we don't need too much of that. We need some of it, but we don't need too much. And we do need to analyze what's going on today. Update analysis. Okay. Solidarity, everyone.
Thank you, Minnie. I'm sorry to hurry along. We've actually got 7 people who want to speak. We've actually quite a lot of people put their hand up now. So I'm going to have to restrict you all to 3 minutes. I'm afraid we usually don't do that. And I don't agree with that as a principle. But when we have that many people, I'm afraid we'll have to try to push everybody in. Soraya, hi.
Hi. Well, comrades, thanks for a very interesting discussion. I think, and I may have misheard, but the Russian Revolution isn't the only revolution we've had. It's just the only genuinely successful one, if only for sadly for a very short period. And there will be revolutions, as there have been. It's just that they haven't been successful, or they've been momentarily successful to then be diverted on a path back towards capitalism, if that's where they're aspiring. And the reason for that is because of a lack of a party. And that, for me, is the reason why there's an urgency to build now. In England, the Labour Party is where the workers look. So you can't ignore it, and you've got to take it into consideration. Talk about dead Bolsheviks and updating analysis. I don't think that figures like Lenin, Trotsky, Marx are out of date or tablets of stone, but we learn, certainly I've learned a great deal from the methods of Marxism, and I don't think those are any way outdated. It's how you present them, isn't it? It's how you talk about it. If you just give long quotes from bad translations, I'm not saying anybody's done that, but if that is done, then it's not going to attract or inspire many people. Corbynism, for me, showed how even really reformist ideas can create a huge movement. And you saw that by the reaction to the programme and people flooding into the party, and the terror of the bourgeoisie and the vicious attacks on Corbyn, who was hardly planning to start a revolution. So I think that shows that there is an opportunity to build something beyond. It's not a question of optimism or pessimism, but what's needed. And I am optimistic about the opportunity and the potential for building a party here. There isn't one. We need one. So my view is we need to build one. It's not enough to be against things. You have to engage in a dialogue with workers and youth to suggest there is an alternative to capitalism. And in fact, that it's essential that we achieve that, because we achieve communism for our planet to survive. And our aim with the statement that we've set out recently in talking about socialism is to start that work. That's not been grandiose or saying we are the new Communist Party, but it's a beginning, and we hope that comrades here will get involved in that.
Thank you, Soraya. Actually, I'm going to take Marion as well before I bring Nick and Ian in briefly. Hi, Marion. We can't hear you. I think there's something wrong with your microphone. Still can't hear you, I'm afraid. Nope. I think I'm going to ask Matthew Jones in that case to come in. Maybe you could try and sort it out, comrade.
All right, comrades, thanks. Obviously, in a brief time, I think there's a few things. I mean, I think and I agree. Obviously, I've agreed with disagreeing with a lot of things that people said in the discussion. I think the key, though, is we've had nearly 150 years experience of organising parties since Marx's death, and we should take account of this. You know, I think there's a couple of things, or a few things, which I think are important at this point. One, first of all, obviously, is the fact that Stalinists have actually, you know, cashed in their position essentially and sold themselves to the capitalists, and you know, in that sense, removed themselves as a political force, which is, of course, both positive and negative. Because I mean, the thing is, I mean, Stalinism was the major obstacle towards the building of any serious organisation. Because apart from anything else, of course, Stalinists were extremely good at killing people. You know, and the impact of Stalinism actually to you know, so essentially spread large chunks of shit on the flag of the working class, and say, you know, really, you know, these are the people that you're talking about when you talk about communism and whatever else, you know, and this vile system, which no reasonable person would put up with, is what you want, and that's not the case. Clearly not the case. The thing is, obviously, that in, you know, coming out of that, of course, is the experience of the Trotskyist groups, and particularly in Britain, of course, because the Stalinists never had a real grip in Britain. And so the Communist Party, unlike the rest of Europe, you know, which you look at mass communist parties in France and Italy and so on, Spain, you know, and of course the Stalinist bloc. In Britain, of course, the Stalinists never amounted, were the largest left organisation, but never amounted to like hundreds of thousands or 500,000 or 1 million. You know, unlike say the French Communist Party or PCI or whatever else. And therefore, you've got the growth of Trotskyist groups, you know, of various types and varieties, more so than anywhere else in the world. In fact, Britain has been one of the key areas in which Trotskyist groups have functioned, and have had a huge political impact. But what you've generally had is the creation of these miniature bureaucracies and you know, positions in which you've had groups which have essentially solidified, and people have jobs for life. And then of course, you know, the machine actually then prevents any form of internal life, and you have a position in which these organisations, like say the Socialist Party, SVP, so you know, there is no internal life of any note. You know, in fact, what happens, of course, is every so often there's an explosion when people can't stand it anymore, or there's a political difference which can't be sorted out, and then there's a split. You know, and that's the way these things operate, and it's dead. You know, it's really to say, okay, well, how do we understand why that is, and what can we do about it? You know, there's only one group, actually, to their credit, who went through that whole thing and said, well, this is what, how, and why the whole damn thing went through, and they took years about it. Was after the dissolution of the WRP in the 80s, and they wrote a big long piece on it, and it's worth referring to. I think the other thing that's important actually is to look at, in my view, that Corbynism, of course, the growth of Corbynism is not about a dedication of the working class to reformism, or the Labour Party, in fact. What it was about is about people looking for some kind of political method of resisting austerity of the Tories and the ruling class to impose the cost of the financial crisis onto the working class. And it's what's actually happening now is that the importance of Stalinism is actually to destroy the Labour Party as it has been. It's not going to exist in the way that you've seen over the last however many decades after this, because they're just going to flatten the entire structure and the entire basis of any involvement and the basis of internal democracy and so on and so forth in the Labour Party. That's what they're doing. They've said as much, and that's what they're doing. So the thing is actually going to change its nature. And the question is then, okay, well, what's the alternative, and what can the left actually present any kind of alternative? Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Ian and Nick, would you like to come back on a few things that have come up now?
Only very briefly, because I want as many people as they can. Just about the whole idea of a mass reformist movement can become much more, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think had Corbyn had a bit more courage and had been prepared to start to expel the right, to do to the right exactly what they are now doing to the left, things could have been very different. But it's one of those things. If you don't take the moment at the flood tide, then you're set back. So, but I absolutely agree that you could have a reformist movement, because of course in the end, reformist movements themselves will come up against the buffers, and it's at that point that the demands become more extreme. You can go back to the English Revolution if you want. No one's set out with the idea of killing the king. But the logic of the revolution carried it forward to a republic, and I think that's what we may well see in the future.
Thank you, Ian. Nick, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry, I had to mute everybody.
Only 4 years in, still getting it wrong. So excellent contributions by people, and don't agree with all of them. So I'm going to focus first of all on Tony's contribution, because I do fundamentally and completely disagree with really the main points that he was making, and if I've made a correct note of them, it's impossible to create it's impossible to create a revolutionary party in Britain. I fundamentally disagree with that, and if I did think that was right, I'd be doing a Garibaldi and I'd be going and growing potatoes. Soraya's made the point. In fact, the working class has no alternative. It has to struggle. Whether people realize it now or not, they know that they have to struggle. And so struggles will take place. The question is, what direction is that struggle going to take? Why did the German Revolution after the First World War fail? Because there was no Communist Party giving it direction, or the Communist Party that was created by the Spartacist Bund was too small, weak, and didn't have a clear enough program. We have to have a mass socialist party, and by socialist I don't mean reformist, I mean a party that stands for fundamental change, a mass working class party in advance of those struggles. So there will be struggles which will take place, and we won't be big enough to take advantage of them, but we've got to intervene and recruit out of it. So how are we going to win next time? What lessons do we learn? What do you think we need to be doing? Recruiting people all the time. And to do that, we have to be bold and we have to be confident. And if we're not confident and we don't give our ideas to people, how on earth do we expect the working class to get them? I don't agree with those people that say socialist ideas will emerge spontaneously. They may do over a long period of time, but actually the role of the party is to take the good news to the working class. Those of us that have been fortunate enough, blessed enough to understand the ideas that are necessary to change society, we have an obligation, an absolute obligation to find a way of getting those ideas to the working class. And that's what we need. That's why we need a communist party. Starts off small. It's bold, it's confident, it will be dwarfed by reformist organizations and politicians. They'll get bigger meetings, they'll speak to larger audiences, we might get frustrated, but we've got to have the patience that our ideas can be absorbed by working class. So we have to have confidence in our arguments, and we have to have confidence in the working class.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, next round. I think I'm just going to take everybody in one block and then get Ian and Nick to sum up. Marion, I've promised we'll try again if microphone.
Hello, is that better?
Yes, now we can hear you. Hi.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we do construct a revolutionary party based on the Marx, Engels, Trotsky, and the revolutionaries in the past, and that we need to have a thorough understanding of what that represents. But equally, that's important, and I'm optimistic because I think the working class is developing ideas around the world, and there is a lot of interest in Marxism and ideas. The question for me is, how do we engage and how do we take our understanding of Marxism and the overthrow of capitalism to people in the trade unions or in campaigns or whatever? Now, it's interesting, during the last elections, one of the things that was being put forward is the abolition of food banks. Now, some people thought you were just going to do away with them, and people with the need wouldn't then be able to go to food banks. So it wasn't explained properly that indeed, if we overthrow this system, there wouldn't be any need for food banks, that everybody would be fed, and there's enough food in the world for no starvation. So it is about how you concretize the ideas to win the masses over. But you do need political clarity as well, because I don't agree with Nick on his analysis of what China is and what the state in China is. So there will be differences. So we can work together on where we agree. But for me, I wouldn't join an organisation that didn't have the question of certain ideas are important. And for me, to be a revolutionary party, you've got to have a certain common framework. Otherwise, it'll fly apart again. But that doesn't mean to say I wouldn't engage with people and debate with them. I think that's very important. But for me, a revolutionary party has to have clarity, understanding, full democracy. I mean, I've been in organisations where there's been no democracy. And where I do agree with Nick is a lot of people see the Labour Party as a principle. It's a tactic. I'll give a fine illustration of that. When I was in, can't remember the name of it, with Alan Fournier, there was a big debate whether we should support the running of the old militant candidates that have been bureaucratically expelled from the Labour Party. My attitude is yes, we should fully support them because they were being bureaucratically excluded from the debate. So it's a tactical question. But for me, the key thing is, how do we construct a revolutionary party based on Marxism, based on the ideas of overthrowing capitalism? Because that is clear. What is crystal clear now, and should be to many people, is that the current world order, the current world system of capitalism and imperialism does not meet the needs of the vast majority of people in the world. And therefore, we have to win those arguments about how we construct a party. But we have to be prepared to go in and engage with people at the level they're at and change the consciousness. And the key thing is we have to be optimistic, because there's enough pessimism. If you've got to be optimistic to say that we can overthrow capitalist societies. It's been done before, and if we can do it again. So that's the key thing. Be optimistic, but be clear on your ideas.
Thank you, comrade. Harry next.
Hi, comrades. Still a member of the Labour Party here in Northern Ireland, for me anyway. I think that in this question, I got a feeling we're putting the cart before the horse, because if you go back the existing parties that were set up, great movements really in their own right, Syriza, Podemos, and of course the Corbyn initiative, they all degenerated, largely because there was no working class control of it. It was just an elite that went on their own agenda. You take the existing parties today that are around us. I mean, I've been involved in Left Horizon, and to be honest with you, to me, it's degenerated very much to reformism and to running the capitalist system. I was formerly with Workers' International Network. Exactly the same thing happened. It degenerated. It lost its perspectives and lost its way. Militant, huge international in the 1970s and 80s and so on. I was a member for many years. It degenerated to pure Stalinism. That international, I think, was the biggest loss that we have seen in working class organizations throughout the world. And I mean, these parties that exist today, I mean, even if they were, which they're not, they have no intention of working with anyone else. They want to do it on their own, build their own parties. They're the ones that are going to be the vanguard of the working class and so on. And I honestly believe that I don't think we have anything to really gain by working with them. You have to remember that our enemies are not just outside, they're within. I mean, what destroyed the Corbyn initiative here in Northern Ireland and was a mass? We were the largest party, the Labour Party, with a huge active base. It was destroyed by the Communist Party of Ireland. They organised within it and they brought it down. And that basically finished us off right there. And by the way, I could go on with other groups that do exactly the same thing. You see, I think what's missing here is that if we are to set up an organisation, it's about the party that's going to win the working class. Any party, just like the Bolsheviks did, they won over the working class. And you need a clear objectives, but you also need, in my opinion, a very tight party, not a broad-based party, strict, tight party that's going to organize. The key in the organization, and this is why I talk about the cart before the horse, is it's building from the bottom up. If you look at even the strikes that have taken place, there was a mood, in my opinion, creeping into the strike movement, that the workers realized they had to set up some form of committees, which incidentally had to be independent of the trade unions. If they were part of the trade union, they were under the trade union bureaucracy. They needed committees set up in their workplaces to basically deal with the strikes and to hold the strikes and to hold the bureaucracy and the trade union together. That mood, I think, was slowly creeping in. It's an extremely low ebb. I admit to that there. The key to building this and the way forward, I'll finish now, Tina, is workers' committees. We need to concentrate in the workplace. Are they going to be set up broad-based immediately? No, the consciousness is very low. But I do believe we've got to raise the demand. If those committees are set up, that's when I believe the new formation will develop. Not before. Those committees will be the new formation. But I think if we had a party to raise those demands, that could facilitate in the period that we now need, that we're now moving into. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Harry. Diana next, and then Sandy.
Right. Yeah. First, I point out, I think everybody here knows that this censorship, lies, and propaganda we're subjected to in mainstream media is an enormous problem, because what we get there is the stuff that too many people believe, and that's hiding the truth of what's happening with Ukraine. The proxy war in Ukraine started 9 years ago with the US CIA-backed 2014 Maidan coup, which put the Banderite Nazis into key positions of power and control. Following that, there has been anti-worker actions in Ukraine. There was the murder of in the Odessa massacre of trade unionists being burnt alive in the trade union building. We now have the TUC, Unite and GMB pushing for more weapons to support NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, against the proxy war against Russia. And given that the Ukraine regime is so anti-worker and just anti-people generally, how could a genuine socialist or communist movement work with or wish to work with the current British trade unions who are pushing for such an anti-worker regime in Ukraine?
Thank you, Diane. Sandy, please, is the last speaker from the floor, and then we're going back to our main speakers.
I very much agree with the points that have been made about the need for workers' committees. I think that if working class goes into struggle as it has, and it will, it needs to organise itself independently of the trade union bureaucracy, because they'll always smother and sell out the struggle. In terms of building a communist party, well, I mean, Tony's point about it not being possible in the present period, I disagree. I agree it's not possible in Britain alone, but it is possible to build an international communist movement. And that is always the strategy we should have, to look to build a movement, not just in Britain, but in Europe and internationally. And obviously the key point at the moment in that regard is the war in Ukraine. It's the imperialist war drive that's on against Russia and against China, and that is radicalizing the world. And it's something that's not going to stop. And we have to build an international movement to combat that. And it's within building that movement that you will start to link up communists internationally to build a real movement, a bit like the movement that was built when the Social Democrats sold out in 1914 and we had the Zimmerwald Conference. We need to build a movement like that to organize communists who are opposed to imperialism, who want to fight for world socialism, who want workers' democracy on an international basis. These are the people we have to link up with, and you won't just do it in Britain. And when you do start to link up, you'll find that most of the British left is controlled partly by the British state through infiltrators, but is also controlled by the Labour bureaucracy, because they're working for the Labour bureaucracy, they're getting their wages paid by the Labour bureaucracy and the trade unions, etc., and they will side with them rather than side with the working class. And the last point, one of the things that was wrong with the Corbyn movement was it was a British movement, just like what was wrong with Syriza was it was a Greek movement and Podemos was a Spanish movement. We need an international movement to confront capitalism. You can't do it in one country, and workers can see that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. There were probably other things wrong with those movements as well, but yes, good point. Our movement has to be international. Yes, I've been fighting with a little kitten. Somebody have been commenting, so sorry about that, but I was paying attention. Very interesting discussion. Thank you for your contributions, questions from the floor. I suggest that Ian goes first, again, summing up or, replying to some of the contributions from the floor, please.
Yeah, excellent contributions from the floor. I mean, I don't disagree with hardly any of them. But I think crucially, we need to talk about what socialism is and what it isn't. And that needs to be sort of front and center of any political organization that we develop, as part of any group that intervenes in other organizations. I'm completely in favor of it being an explicitly communist party. I'm completely in favor of it being explicitly Marxist. There are organizations which I could feel that I could easily work with in a principled way at any time. And the more we bring together, the better. I've mentioned it in the past, but sometimes it might even be worth starting small, as it were, to try and bring groups together around the discussion, for example, of political economy, of ideas, of how to move together. I mean, the difficulty we have, of course, is that parties like the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party are not easily going to merge, but we need to be able to work together in some form or another, whether it's around electorally or whether, as Sandy rightly says, about opposing the NATO's imperialist actions in Ukraine and elsewhere. I remain optimistic, not least of which because what we have going for us is our ideas, and an understanding of the present is crucial to going anywhere. Reading volume 1 of Capital is invaluable, but it's frozen in time if we don't constantly update it, and if we don't constantly look at what's money today at a time when it's mostly fiat money, for example. Marx didn't really write about the state, although that was one of his intentions. Why aren't we developing that? And I'm absolutely in favour of trying to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Nick.
Excellent discussion, comrades, and I see this as being just one early step in the discussions that the left, and particularly the Marxist left, has to have to create the party that is necessary. It's not a question of, is it possible? I believe it's possible. The point is, the starting point is it's necessary. Let's start from the position of what do we need? We need a party that argues for our ideas. And if we don't get it, we can't be surprised or disappointed or frustrated if those ideas diminish and retreat even further in the working class. And then we turn around and blame the working class for not being understanding. It's the leadership of the working class that has let the working class down again and again and again. And we have to make sure that we don't do that from now on. And so however small it is, we need to get groups of comrades together to discuss this, and there may be differences. And if the differences are fundamental, for example, as Marion has raised, then obviously for the time being, we're not in the same organization, if that is the conclusion. But if you read the statement, which I hope people look up, I've posted it in the chat, and it's on Talking About Socialism from a Marxist Point of View website. If you look in the About section of that website, I'd be really interested for comments and criticism and disagreement and engagement. And I'd really be interested in pursuing this further. Of course, in the statement, I agree with points that have been made about it has to be international. We have to try and build a new international. It always struck me as being remarkable that, we accept quite happily the fact that the Catholic Church or Islam is organized on a global scale, but we don't think that we can do it when we've got the most modern ideas and ideas that can change people's lives here and now on the planet. So we've got to have that international perspective. And our ideas, they've been tarnished, they've been undermined, they've been destroyed by social democracy and Stalinism. And so we've got to counter that. They've got the advantage on us because they've been around now for over 100 years. They've got the apparatus. The Morning Star, for example, in Britain, is the paper of the left bureaucracy. Stalinism and social democracy, two sides of the same coin, and that is reformism and nationalism, whereas we are revolutionary and international. So we've got to get our ideas out. What's the most famous phrase of Marx? Well, one of them, philosophers have until now only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. That's what we should take from Marx. We have to change the world.
This was a very enlightening and interesting first discussion of a series of discussions we're holding over the next 10 weeks on Marx and party building. We're looking at different aspects to it, for example, their critique of various programs, their efforts to write programs themselves, their engagement with organizations like the First International, etc., etc. Also with their critique of trade unionists and syndicalism, or trade unionism, I should say, not trade unionists. And these are all issues that feed into our understanding of what kind of party we can and should form. I think this is a really important point, what that Nick made at the end. It's not just, is it possible? You know, if it's necessary, it has to be possible, clearly, and we have to make sure that we are working towards making it possible. So thank you very much all for coming, and we hope to see you next Thursday. See you soon, comrades. Good night.